Hello and welcome to the Integrational Polytheism YouTube channel. Before we start, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and to click like on this video if you like it, and ring the notification bell as well, because otherwise subscriptions don't come up on your feed. Anyway, I've been meaning to make a video for a while on this subject, but the recent video from Simon Whistler was a good prompt for me to get my behind in gear. So I've decided to use Simon Whistler's video as the basis for mine, and to do it as a response style video. I do show quite a lot of Simon Whistler's video in this one, but I've only actually showed the bits I want to comment on. So if you're interested to see the whole thing, there's a link in the description to that, as well as to some other resources that are connected with this subject. I haven't gone overboard on those, but I have tried to include a range of references, not just material from one side of the issue. I'll also say before I start that I am not motivated by some ethos or doctrine. I just looked at what evidence there is about the historicity of Jesus, and I found that it was woefully unconvincing to me. When I set aside the oft-repeated claims and cultural assumptions, it turned out the evidence was scant, late, and unconvincing. That's all. I'm not a crazy person or some vindictive conspiracy theorist. To be honest, I think it's quite sad that those who disagree with this position seem to sometimes have to resort to those kinds of slurs and insults. The evidence is what matters, and if you need to insult people to make your case, then you either haven't got the evidence to back your case up, or you don't know the evidence well enough to do so. And I'm not saying that Jesus definitely didn't exist either. I'm just saying I think that the burden of proof should really be on the one making the claim that this person did exist, and that the evidence doesn't support that very well. And I'm pretty disappointed with the dogmatic and often aggressive way that people frequently assert that Jesus did exist. Often they state that there's plenty of corroborating contemporary evidence, and yet they often come up with very little to show for that claim. Anyway, with that, as they say, let's get into it.
At least those who followed the religions take for granted really did exist. This brings us to the subject of today. Did the founder of one of the most significant religions in human history, Jesus of Nazareth, actually exist? And if so, what do we definitively know about what he did or said? As the first question, yes, unequivocally. As Jesus was an incredibly popular name in the region around the time Jesus was said to have walked the earth, Jesus of Nazareth definitely existed. That's like saying, did John from New York exist? Yes, New York, John exists. He's a nice guy, makes great pizza. But that's not very interesting. So, what about the Jesus?
Right, very good. And this makes sense, of course, except that unlike New York, Nazareth is believed to have been a tiny hamlet during the time of Jesus. In fact, some, for example René Salm, have even claimed that Nazareth was uninhabited during the early 1st century CE. There's a link in the description where you can read Bart Ehrman discrediting Salm's claim that Nazareth was uninhabited during Jesus' time, but you can see from reading it that this is actually inconclusive. We can say that Nazareth was inhabited somewhere between 100 BCE and 100 CE, so that's a 200-year window, but it's difficult to get any more accurate than that, according to Dr. Ehrman's article. I think it's logical to expect that Nazareth was inhabited and known by the latter end of the 1st century CE, since it's mentioned in the Gospels as the place where Jesus came from, and they were written in the late 1st century CE. And we know that Nazareth is a big city nowadays, since Christians for the most part have come to settle there for obvious reasons. But it's not a hill that I want to die on, so to speak, because I actually don't think it has much bearing on whether Jesus existed or not, since he could have come from somewhere else. But it is worth noticing that we don't have as much solid proof as you might be led to believe to support the idea that Nazareth did exist in Jesus' time. I actually think that Jesus of Nazarene might then be a reference to the Nazarites, if it doesn't refer to the town of Nazareth. And this is a Nazarite is a particularly devout follower of God, who can't eat anything made of grapes, they can't cut their hair, amongst other things. The full specification for that is given in Numbers chapter 6. And the earliest Nazarite mentioned in the Bible seems to be Samson, unless I've missed an earlier one, in Judges chapter 13 and 14. Nazarite means one who is set apart, so it does seem to fit with Jesus, although we should note that the earliest Gospel, the Gospel of Mark, does say that Jesus came from Nazareth in the Galilee, although, as I say, that Gospel was written in the latter part of the 1st century, 40 or 50 years after Jesus' supposed time. And it's important to remember that we don't know specifically who wrote any of the Gospels, and it seems likely that they were all written after the Jewish War in 70 CE by people too far separated from Jesus by time or distance to actually have had first knowledge about him, if he existed in the time frame that's being claimed. While I'm here though, I do want to give kudos to Simon Whistler for having a Scottish Jesus in the background while he does this section. Very good.
But that's not very interesting. So, what about the Jesus of Nazareth? Well, while it might come as something of a surprise to some, for reasons we'll get into momentarily, historians, from atheist to agnostic to Jewish to Christian, pretty much all universally agree that the Jesus described in the New Testament did in fact exist, and even that it's extremely likely that at minimum a couple of key significant elements of his life as described in the New Testament also very likely did happen, which we'll get into at the tail end of this.
Okay, now the statement that historians pretty much all universally agree that Jesus existed is a very loaded statement. First of all, the majority of scholars working in this area are Christians, and many are beholden to a statement of faith, a document that their employer, usually a religious college of some sort, requires them to sign as a condition of their employment. I hope you can see that this means the majority of scholars are basically required to believe that Jesus existed, despite any evidence or lack thereof. Regarding those scholars who are not Christians, remember that they come from a culture, just like probably you and I do, where we all accept without question that Jesus existed. You know how absurd it sounds when you first hear the claim that Jesus never existed. I certainly remember how absurd it sounded to me when I first heard this claim. Even if you're not a Christian, that's the kind of cultural thing it's very difficult to let go of, which is why the comments on YouTube videos, because our culture is so embedded in Christianity and history, even if we're not Christians now, you know. But that's why the comments of YouTube videos that discuss this subject tend to be very heated and polarised, I would say. So you can understand that for secular scholars who've built their career on a historical Jesus, and many of them have visited and been closely involved with many of the places Jesus is supposed to have visited, these scholars have a considerable amount invested in continuing to believe that Jesus did exist in history. Even having said that, I think saying that all historians pretty much agree is doing a disservice to those scholars who don't. Both Doctors Richard Carrier and Raphael Lataster have recently published peer-reviewed books arguing against the historicity of Jesus. And I have to note that Dr. Bart Ehrman's famous book, Did Jesus Exist?, was not peer-reviewed, unlike quite a lot of his other books. But it went straight to being released as a popular book for the public with no peer review involved.
Tail end of this video. As archaeologist and historian Dr. Byron McCain of the Atlantic University of Florida states, I do not know, nor have I heard of, any trained historian or archaeologist who has doubts about his existence. That said, that's not to say there aren't many people out there who don't agree. For example, a 2015 poll in Britain surveying around 4,000 people found that a whopping 40% of them did not believe that Jesus ever existed.
Now, this is just poisoning the well. We're 2 minutes into Simon Whistler's video now, and all he's done is tell us that historians pretty much all think Jesus existed, that and that one historian is quoted as saying he doesn't know of any historian or archaeologist who disagrees with that, and that 40% out of 4,000 nameless schlubs from the general public don't think Jesus existed. The strong implication here is that the public don't know what they're talking about, because historians all pretty much know that Jesus did exist. Now, I want you to note that no evidence has actually been presented either way at this point. An argument from consensus or from authority doesn't actually prove anything, though, except that a lot of people agree with each other, and maybe that some of them have PhDs. I say, let's see the evidence, and if there is indeed strong evidence for Jesus' existence, why does Simon Whistler need to give this big build-up about historians being convinced and the great unwashed having no clue? Just go straight to the evidence rather than trying to pre-bias the audience, I would say.
Jesus ever existed. But going back to historians, Professor Emeritus of Jewish Studies and Archaeology at Duke University, Dr. Eric Myers, concludes with Dr. McCain chiming in, I don't know any mainstream scholar who doubts the historicity of Jesus. The details have been debated for centuries, but no one who is serious doubts that he's a historical figure. Those who deny the existence of Jesus are like the deniers of climate change.
Yeah, this is just more of the same. I want you to notice that, again, no evidence has actually been presented yet. But now we're told that a distinguished former professor from Duke University has confidently stated that Jesus mythicists are no better than climate change deniers. Again, let's see the evidence, rather than this ridiculous round of insults. I wasn't even going to include this section in my video, but I did, because this is quite the normal thing for critics to say to Jesus mythicists. Without a shred of evidence, it is quite usual for people to say I am mentally retarded, or that I'm no better than a Holocaust denier. Both things that people have actually said to me because they found out that I'm not convinced Jesus existed, you know? They often don't present any real evidence. They just belittle and ridicule. Or that's been my experience anyway.
Jesus are like the deniers of climate change. End quote. Holdouts to the idea that Jesus existed like to point out, however, that we don't have any hard archaeological evidence or writings from Jesus himself, or even surviving contemporary writings from when he supposedly lived corroborating his existence. This is correct. However, if that's the rubric being used to tell if some historic figure actually existed or not, we'd pretty much have to assert that almost nobody in history ever existed, including some extremely prominent figures absolutely no one, including many of these holdouts' questions.
Okay, now his language continues to be extremely loaded and biased here. I'm not a holdout. In fact, it's been unquestionably believed for millennia that Jesus did actually exist. The idea that he didn't exist in history is actually quite a recent idea, I would say, that's only starting to gain traction. I think that as we go forward into the future, we will see the historicity of Jesus being questioned more and more within scholarship, though obviously not within Christianity. The use of the phrase holdouts to suggest that Jesus mythicists are just clinging on to some out-of-date idea that's been thoroughly disproved is simply nonsense. As to the content of what Whistler is saying here, this is not the whole story at all. There are very few historical figures for whom we have direct proof. For example, we have Julius Caesar's diaries, which he wrote himself, but that's a very rare exception. Alexander the Great, for example, wasn't biographized until after his death, but we know he existed because he had such a huge direct effect on the lands and the people he conquered and administered. And because the independent sources that wrote about him in different languages and locations match up with what we can see from archaeology, and unlike Jesus, that archaeology includes more than one stone stele which specifically mentions Alexander the Great. I'd also add that for most historical figures, we don't have any reason to think that they might have been made up. We accept that Alexander, Nero, and Socrates, and many others did exist, because unlike Jesus, there wasn't any pressing or obvious need to make them up out of whole cloth. On the other hand, in Roman Palestine in the 1st century BCE, the air was rife with apocalypticism and messianism, with the people commonly believing that God was on the verge of stepping in and sending his Messiah, his anointed one, to save the chosen people from Roman occupation. The word Jesus, or its Aramaic equivalent, Yeshu, actually means God's Saviour, so there's even the chance that it's a title rather than a name, though that is supposition. The point I'm making here is that there were plenty of reasons for fictional Jesus to have sprung up in the collective consciousness of the day. It might even be a composite of several real historical men who were travelling around giving their views on the kinds of matters that the Jesus of the New Testament is said to have dealt with. I would remind that, by the way, would be a good explanation for why some of the sayings of Jesus seem to contradict each other if they had come from different travelling rabbis. I would remind you at this point that just because the Gospels throw in real-life place names and even actual historical figures such as Pontius Pilate, this doesn't say anything about there having been a historical Jesus. Proving that there was a historical Pilate doesn't prove that there was a historical Jesus, right? Now back to the lack of evidence. Jesus not only didn't write anything, and we don't have any surviving writings from anybody who knew or met him, but there also aren't any independent corroborating writings about him from the time, since the epistles of Paul were known to the author of the Gospel of Mark, right? And the Gospel of Mark, in its turn, was known to the authors of the other Gospels. So you can see how they're all getting it from each other, right the way back to Mark. Right the way back to Paul. There are a couple of sources for that in the description, but if you look into it yourself, you'll find that pretty much all historians agree on this, which means that Paul ultimately was the only source for a historical Jesus actually having existed. And there's no doubt that Paul thought Jesus existed. He says in his epistles that Jesus was born of a woman, that he was the Christ, that he died by being crucified, and that he was taken up. That's basically all that Paul says about the earthly Jesus in his epistles, and the rest is all about the post-resurrection Jesus, which Paul believed would come to him in visions. I will let you decide whether you consider this to be a credible and reliable witness to the historical Jesus, someone who never met him, but who had frequent post-mortem visions of him. Now, it's important for me to acknowledge that Paul also says in his letter to the Galatians that he stayed for a fortnight with the Apostle Peter and James, the brother of the Lord. And this seems to match up with a term found in Josephus's Antiquities, book 20, about James, the brother of Jesus, who is called the Christ. I will note here, however, that both of these texts only survive due to having been copied by Christians, and the early surviving copies are from centuries after they were first written, so there has been plenty of occasion for the texts to have been possibly changed, as we know did often happen with theological texts from the late Bronze Age in the Mediterranean region. Nevertheless, I would say that these two mentions, Galatians chapter 2 and Josephus' Antiquities book 20, are the best evidence for a historical Jesus that exists. I mention it here to steelman the historicist position. And again, I ask you to consider whether that evidence alone is enough to confirm the existence of a historical Jesus.
Going back to Dr. Bart Ehrman, he sums up, with respect to Jesus, we have numerous independent accounts of his life in the sources lying behind the Gospels and the writings of Paul, some that originate in Jesus' native tongue, Aramaic, and that can be dated to within just a year or two of his life, before the religion moved to convert pagans in tropes. Historical sources like that are pretty astounding for an ancient figure.
Right, I'm sorry to contradict Dr. Ehrman so flatly, especially when I don't have any relevant qualifications or languages to speak of. But what he says here just isn't true. As I've said already, Paul is the source for information about Jesus found in the Gospel of Mark, and that's the only narrative source for the other Gospels. All of these texts were written originally in Greek, not translated from Aramaic, as textual analysis has shown, and Dr. Ehrman knows this, as a fluent Greek reader and a textual critic himself. The Pauline epistles and all four Gospels count as one source only, not multiple sources, and I've heard Dr. Ehrman say as much himself several times in various interviews. Many other well-known biblical scholars often say the same. I heard John Dominic Crossan say as much in a recent interview as well. I think he's even a Christian as well as a New Testament scholar.
So, putting aside holding the question of Jesus' existence to a higher standard than anyone else in history, what about when we apply the standards historians do generally ascribe to? What's the actual evidence there?
Yes, now we're into the 6th minute of your video. Maybe we can start to look at some of the actual evidence.
Relative smoking guns here. The most obvious answer is, of course, the writings in the New Testament itself. Now, on the surface, you may discount this, as using the Bible to prove the Bible seems rather absurd. So why do most historians, including those of the secular variety, not take this view in this case? For starters, the sheer weight of archaeological evidence that backs up a number of things discussed in these works during the periods the works are discussing. This at least demonstrates they weren't just conjured up completely by significantly later.
Right, nobody is making this claim in order to try to say that Jesus didn't exist. It's pretty obvious that most of the place names in the Gospels are real places, and that there is plenty of archaeological evidence for the kinds of boats and houses and so on that they used back then. But there isn't any evidence that supports the existence of a particular person or family associated with Jesus. I think it's great that this archaeological work is being done in Israel, because we can always learn more about our history, but it would be disingenuous to claim that because the Gospels are set in a real-world setting, that this somehow adds any weight to the argument for Jesus' existence. A well-known analogy is Spider-Man, who also lives in New York, like John from earlier on. New York exists, and there is plenty of evidence of that. And there's even evidence that the occasional real-world person has appeared in a Spider-Man story. But does this mean that a real Spider-Man, or even a real Peter Parker without any supernatural powers, really exists in New York? I think the answer is obvious. We're not investigating the reality of the Gospel settings or supporting cast here. We're evaluating the evidence to support a particular person in history, such as it is. And the Gospels don't actually support this. The journeys that Jesus takes in the Gospels often don't make sense when you look at a map. The stories that are repeated in more than one Gospel sometimes happen in a different setting, like the feeding of the 5,000, which happens in a deserted place in the Gospel of Mark, but the same event happens in a city in the Gospel of Matthew. And the details often contradict each other, like how the Gospel of John says that Jesus was crucified on the Thursday before Passover, and the Synoptic Gospels have him crucified on the Friday of Passover, or how the Gospel of John has Jesus getting angry at the money changers in the temple and then going back home to fashion a scourge so he can come back the next day with it and overturn the tables. But the Synoptic Gospels have Jesus overturning the tables as soon as he sees the money changers. All of this suggests that these narratives have been essentially made up. Possibly they have a basis in real life, but if the details are so fuzzy as that, then maybe they refer to different people, even different occasions where maybe two different men overturned the tables or what have you. And that's before we even get into Dennis R. MacDonald's work showing that essentially all of the Gospel of Mark, the earliest Gospel upon which the others were based, is entirely a reworking of pre-Christian Greek literature. Dennis R. MacDonald himself believes that Jesus existed, however, and he even said in a recent interview that those of us who don't are intellectually bankrupt, despite his own research showing that basically the Gospels are fiction. This illustrates the level of emotional commitment that even a professional biblical scholar has to the idea of a historical Jesus, even despite the conclusions of his own work. Of course, Dennis R. MacDonald is also a Christian, so perhaps his faith has something to do with it.
Beyond this, some investment positing that a group would not completely make up a story that would embarrass themselves. Thus, as historian Will Durant notes, despite the prejudices and theological preconceptions of the evangelists, they record many incidents that mere inventors would have concealed. The competition of the apostles for high places in the kingdom, their flight after Jesus' arrest, Peter's denial, the failure of Christ to work miracles in Galilee, the references of some auditors to his possible insanity, his early uncertainty as to his mission, his confessions of ignorance as to the future, his moments of bitterness, his despairing cry on the cross.
Firstly, the criterion of embarrassment is the reason why I think we can say that John the Baptist did exist, despite being mentioned only in the Gospels and possibly in Josephus. The existence of John the Baptist is arguably embarrassing for all four Gospels, since his baptism by water doesn't really seem necessary within the Christian model of vicarious atonement through the human sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And yet John the Baptist appears in all four Gospels to some extent, which suggests he was a real and very well-known and popular figure, and that each Gospel wanted to make a connection between the Jesus narrative and the existing good feeling towards John the Baptist amongst the people. As to the list of other examples, that's a good list, and I noticed that all of these examples originate in the Gospel of Mark. I'd recommend anybody to take a good close look at this Gospel, as I recently did. It's usually overlooked by Christians, since almost all of it is quoted in the Gospel of Matthew. But the Gospel of Matthew usually changes the meaning of the passages that it takes from the Gospel of Mark, so it's better to study the Gospel of Mark in its own right. If you do, you'll easily see that it almost reads like a polemic against the wishful thinking, happy-clapping type of Christianity that we sometimes see Paul railing against in his epistles. The author of Mark always has the disciples failing Jesus and never understanding what he says because they represent the more Jewish branch of early Christianity that insisted you had to follow all the laws of the Torah. That's more like the position that the Gospel of Matthew actually takes. So Matthew makes the disciples a bit less stupid and clueless in his reworking of Mark. So yeah, it's no wonder that he usually changes the meaning. The Gospel of Mark, therefore, shows a Jesus which is helpless and forlorn at the end of his life, with disciples that fail him and, in fact, that run away as soon as he is arrested. And with Jesus telling us in the Gospel of Mark that we must sell all our possessions and go to the cross with him in order to be saved. It's not a very pretty message, so no wonder the later gospel authors wanted to soften it up a bit. None of this, however, actually argues for a historical Jesus. I'm not even 100% sure that the author of Mark necessarily believed in a historical Jesus himself, although I think he probably did, but it isn't really the main point of his gospel. Whether Jesus existed or not, the message of Mark is one of asceticism and humility, and it speaks more to the existence of early Christians as a group, that the author of Mark saw as hedonistic and selfish, rather than to the existence of a specific actual historical Jesus. I might address this Bart Ehrman quote as well, since Simon Whistler has chosen to highlight it. The point is made pretty clearly that if people had wanted to create a fictional Jesus, then they wouldn't have had him being crucified. because that would be embarrassing to the movement. But it isn't really as simple as that. The Gospel of Mark shows Jesus' disciples expecting Jesus, as the Messiah, to be this conquering hero. The main point of the Gospel of Mark is exactly that the Messiah, Jesus, was the opposite of what the disciples, representing the Jewish orthodoxy, were expecting. The earliest Gospel deliberately challenges the well-known expectations of a heroic conquering Messiah, and subverts them to replace them with a dying Messiah that seemed to be utterly defeated. As I say, I think this is because the author wanted to make the case that the Jesus movement should not be beholden to Judaism in any way. In other words, there's a foundational and clear reason for having a crucified hero rather than a triumphal one. Also, if Jesus didn't exist in history, then it would be far easier to make the claim that he was executed as a criminal in relative obscurity than that he had, conquered Rome and brought peace to the world, which is what the Messiah was expected to do, because those things clearly hadn't happened in the mid to late 1st century when the Gospels were written. If the early Christians had invented a triumphal Jesus, then that claim would have been instantly falsifiable. In fact, I'm going to also play you the clip of Dennis R. MacDonald that I mentioned earlier, since he also asks this same question in his own way and then posits his own hypothetical answer. The clip I'm going to play you now is nearly 3 minutes long, but I think you should hear the full comments from Dennis R. MacDonald.
You get that instead. So it's a lot more likely, in my opinion, that the likeliest scenario is the simplest one. It's just the text is what it says, but we can take away things that are supernatural. We can take away things that we know that they borrowed from the Old Testament. For example, Judah sold Joseph for 20 shekels. Judas sells Jesus. Okay, we know that's a literary creation. We know that stuff. We know you talk about the mimesis stuff too. We can point all that out, but at the end of the day, there's still a skeleton of something historical kernel there.
Well, and why develop a character who is shamefully crucified by Rome and and has this antipathy among Jews? I'm going to make two comments, one comment and then a question. In my view, the mythicist position is intellectually bankrupt, and I'm really tired of talking about it.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, I just don't see. But here's the question I have for you, and it's an open one for me, and you may have more insight into it than I do. Why does this idea have traction? I don't get the attraction of it. Now, I can imagine what the attraction might be, and it may be a combination of things. It could be that people are so angry at the Christian religion that, and they're skeptical, as they should be, in my view, about a God and God talk. And one way to stick it up the nose of Christians is to say that Jesus is fabricated too. And there's some people that have used my work on mythologizing Jesus to say that the mythologizing Jesus goes back to mythologizing Jesus himself. Well, I just don't think that is at all helpful, and I think it chooses to ignore lots of evidence. Another way that I think maybe mythicism works is its novelty. It's imaginative. It allows one to take these texts and to view them as a way of human creation. But it does so usually then to poo-poo it. It's not as if they think these creations are wonderful. It's rather that they have this tragic consequence in the history of the church. I mean, I just don't understand the value of mythicism, honestly. And I think it's so bankrupt intellectually that I really, this is going to sound awful. I think they don't need a scholar, they need a therapist.
First of all, really? This sort of childish playground level insult is what this hypothesis attracts from a supposedly reputable scholar, and one who has spent his career basically showing that the Gospels are all ripped off from earlier Greek mythology. I'm reminded of that Mahatma Gandhi quote, "First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win." Now, I don't have any interest in winning anything here, but it is important to me that a hypothesis which seems perfectly reasonable shouldn't just be laughed at and ridiculed and people who put it forward insulted. Now, back briefly to Dennis R. MacDonald's question about the value of mythicism. Well, it's not clear he's asking this question seriously. It might help if I answer it as if he had. I myself decided to begin with the hypothesis that there wasn't a historical Jesus, for a change, since everyone else seems to start with the opposite assumption, right? And then, once you've got the hypothesis, you set out to disprove it. That's a scientific method, right? You propose a hypothesis and then you try to disprove that as rigorously as possible. That's all I'm doing here. And I was initially surprised to find just how scant and vague the evidence actually is. Now, I don't know what Dennis R. MacDonald's talking about here, because I'm not angry at God. I'm not even angry at Christians or the church. Well, there is plenty to be angry about, actually, for those children who were abused by the clergy, or people who found themselves hoodwinked into joining a community or organisation that expects them to donate their money and time for the rest of their lives, and to live and behave in a certain way under fear of eternal punishment, regardless of what their personal, emotional or psychological needs might actually be. But I'm not angry at any of that myself. You don't change the world by seething with anger. You change it through education. And that's why I started with the hypothesis that Jesus didn't exist, and then sought to educate myself. I asked myself what in this world today would actually be different if Jesus had or hadn't existed. And I realised that basically Christianity would have existed in very much the same way as it does, whether Jesus was one real historical man or not, since the religion is based not on any historical person, but on the writings collected in the New Testament, none of which were written by anybody who'd ever met a real historical Jesus. In fact, I might just point out that it doesn't matter if there was a real historical Jesus, because honestly, the outcome in the real world today is exactly the same. The fact that we can't actually prove it one way or the other, as there isn't enough evidence either way, shows us that those who emphatically state that Jesus did exist are doing so on the basis of faith, whether they're Christians or not. I don't say that Jesus definitely didn't exist, I just say that the evidence isn't very convincing that he did. And I also say that most people haven't apparently considered the evidence in an unbiased way. For example, Neil Sendiak's comments at the start of the clip I just played. I agree that the simplest explanation is the most likely, but I don't agree that believing the gospel accounts unless they seem supernatural is the simplest explanation. A simpler explanation would be that a religion sprung up in response to the very complicated socio-political situation of the day in Judea at the time, especially the loss of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE, and the fact that an increasing number of non-Jews were looking to worship the monotheistic Jewish God, but didn't want to commit to the dietary laws or to be circumcised. These texts from the late 1st century are just a literary creation to support that growing community and give them a feeling of legitimacy, or that would seem to be the simplest explanation to me anyway. Alright, back to Simon Whistler, and let's hope we now get some actual evidence shortly, because, the title of his video is about whether there's any hard evidence for Jesus' existence, and so far there's been none.
Of elements in them, Paul the Apostle's surviving works, considered to have been written around 50 to 60 AD, only about 20 or 30 years after Jesus' accepted death, mention meeting various people who knew Jesus personally, including a brother of Jesus's named James, as well as a couple of Jesus' apostles, including Peter, who Paul was a guest of for a couple of weeks in Jerusalem, not long after Paul's conversion. Further, given these were written not long after Jesus' death and were accepted, it's apparent for this and many other reasons that nobody at the time questioned whether Jesus had existed, many of whom would have been alive when the alleged events occurred, with some of these events quite noteworthy in terms of stirring up trouble amongst Jewish and Roman high.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, this seems to be the strongest evidence for Jesus' existence, that Paul says he met Peter and James in Jerusalem. Paul does also, however, say that, whatever they were, it makes no difference to me. Paul also said that these apostles added nothing to his message. I also want to highlight the very speculative nature of Whistler's assertion that there would have been people around who had met the historical Jesus and they could have refuted any such claims. He himself points out that no such claims that Jesus didn't exist were actually made at the time, so there wasn't actually anything for those people to refute. But also, if Jesus didn't exist, then there wouldn't have been anybody around who had met him, of course, and this means everybody could just assume that other people had of course met him. And that's basically what Christians do to this day. Paul's letters weren't written for at least 20 years after Jesus' supposed death. And they weren't widely circulated till decades later at least, so it actually seems quite unlikely to me that anybody who was alive at the supposed time of Jesus would even have had a chance to chime in their views, actually. And even if they had, we probably wouldn't have their testimony, since we know that a lot of writings from the 1st to 4th centuries CE and beyond simply do not survive, often because Christian copyists chose not to copy them, or actively destroyed them. As such, we still have nothing conclusive at all to support the existence of Jesus in history, and the best evidence is Paul's letter to the Galatians about having met Peter and James in Jerusalem.
Roman higher-ups. On top of this, other evidence strongly suggests Christianity had already exploded in Judea and parts of the Roman Empire at the point Paul was writing. This is important because it would have taken some time for this relatively large spreading to occur, further significantly dwindling the couple of decades between when Jesus is referenced to have existed and when we know for sure a rather large group of people from the region believed he did. On this note, also important in all of this is nobody among the non-Christian Jews or Romans seems to have questioned Jesus existed either, even at this very early point when many alive should have been able to know definitively either.
Not really. There were no internet, phone or even newspapers back then. People just didn't know most of what was happening in their time unless they saw it with their own eyes. Nobody could be expected to say that such and such a person didn't exist. If somebody told you about a person, then why would you question their existence? Also, on this point about the religion requiring time in order to spread, this actually goes against the existence of Jesus. We know that there was a lot of popular expectation that a Messiah was going to come, back to the time of the Maccabees. In fact, we know of several other messiahs in the 1st century BC and 1st century CE. You could almost say it was a plague of messiahs. Anyway, if Jesus existed, then you have to have the religion springing up somehow between about 33 CE and the time of Paul, maybe 51 CE or so, which is quite a short window. However, if there was no historical Jesus at all, then this religion could easily have started long before the supposed time of Jesus. Maybe up to 100 years earlier, being spread by word of mouth slowly and forming into something coherent and only actually becoming a narrative about a single man around the time that Jesus was supposed to have lived. In actual fact, if the religion only moved into the form of written material at around the time of the Jewish War as a response to the loss of the temple, then it makes sense that they had Jesus living about 40 years earlier, not just because it mirrors the 40 years in the wilderness of Moses and the Israelites, but also because it made it very unlikely that anyone would come forward who could actually remember those days, especially since many had been killed or scattered in the Jewish War.
Way. And certainly, given all the trouble the Christians were causing the Jews and Romans at the time, the higher-ups here would have had quite the incentive to put forth any evidence that Jesus had not existed to shut up the Christians.
Now, I'm sorry, but this doesn't make much sense. There weren't any Christians until quite a long time after the supposed time of Jesus, as I alluded to a minute ago in my previous comment. And there isn't really any evidence of Christians causing trouble for the Jews or Romans until the early 2nd century CE. So for Whistler to say this all happened at the time is pretty misleading here. Jesus is supposed to have died about 40 years prior to the Jewish War, and following the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, when the inhabitants of Jerusalem and Judea generally were largely killed or dispersed widely, that's when the Gospel started to be written. It would then take another generation or two into the 2nd century, as I say, for there to be any mention of Christians in the historical record. Also, I don't see why anybody opposing Christianity would ever claim that Jesus didn't exist, since nobody would be able to prove it one way or the other. Can you prove that a person you never met didn't actually exist? Of course not. And I can't imagine that your guy didn't exist would be a compelling argument to challenge early Christians with anyway, as Dennis R. MacDonald said in that clip earlier, actually. Alright, now we're in the 10th minute of Simon Whistler's video. We're going to get to some of the actual external evidence, the non-Christian evidence.
So what about some sources that are, shall we say, slightly more independent? Do any such relatively contemporary sources exist? Well, if you've been following along so far and otherwise don't think historians are idiots, it turns out, yes. two of which are generally considered quite definitive, at least with regards to the question of whether Jesus existed. For starters, enter an individual generally considered the greatest of all Roman historians, Senator Publius Cornelius Tacitus, who was born a couple of decades after Jesus' death.
Well, Jesus' supposed death, actually, you're kind of begging the question by saying that he was born after Jesus' death if Jesus didn't exist, but let's carry on.
Death. Tacitus not only gives a direct reference to the particular Jesus in question, but interestingly, he also states that Jesus was crucified by Pilate. In his Annals, 115 AD, in chapter 44 of book 15, he discusses Christians being targeted as a scapegoat by Nero, stating, "Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, for whom the name has its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our protectors, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus where he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed." End quote. Now, it should be noted here that some question if perhaps Tacitus was simply repeating something the Christians themselves were saying, with no backing source elsewise. After all, it had been at this point many decades since Jesus was apparently executed. However, this notion is generally dismissed given Tacitus's preeminence as a historian and track record of having evidence to back what he said so definitively in his works, even if in many cases such evidence is lost to us.
Okay, so I hope you noticed that Tacitus doesn't, as Simon says, refer to a specific Jesus at all. In fact, what Tacitus is talking about is an incident during the reign of Nero, i.e. the 60s CE, which happened in Rome, a long way away from Palestine. And this story deals with a group of Christians who were blamed and persecuted by Nero, and their leader was called Christos. There's nothing in Tacitus's story to suggest that he is asserting the existence of Jesus, only that he asserts the existence of Christians. If such a Christian movement existed in Rome, then of course Tacitus might pick up that they followed someone that they referred to as Christos, so this isn't really evidence for Jesus' existence at all. All Tacitus is doing here is faithfully recording what details he's found out from interviewing other people, and then he's writing it down for posterity in the early 2nd century CE, almost a century after Jesus is supposed to have lived. Even though Whistler assures us that Tacitus always backed his claims up with evidence, it's actually the case that there isn't any supporting evidence for this claim that we know. Suetonius doesn't even mention this supposed blaming of Christians for the fire of Rome when he talks about Neronic persecutions of Christians, and some have suggested that the whole passage might be a later addition to the Annals. Even if it's genuine, however, Tacitus never met Jesus and is writing 80 or 90 years after Jesus supposedly lived, and the story he tells here isn't about Jesus at all. It's about a Christian group in Rome and their leader. So this is one of the best pieces of external evidence for a historical Jesus, and it's already proved to be completely unconvincing as far as I can see. It would be like if someone 2,000 years from now found a Sherlock Holmes novel written in the late 20th century by someone other than Arthur Conan Doyle, obviously, and used that to try to show that there was a real historical Sherlock Holmes.
This suggests that Tacitus would have likely been extremely familiar with and had access to any records of Christianity that existed at that point. Thus, while the skepticism here isn't necessarily completely unwarranted, in combination with Tacitus's reputation and the other evidence at hand and how it all correlates, most historians accept this as a valid early independent source of Jesus'.
Well, they shouldn't, as I hope I've just shown. By the way, scepticism is never unwarranted, and I've often heard this being asserted by many historians and scholars, including Dr. Bart Ehrman, who Whistler's already quoted more than once. It's worth noting here, by the way, that Dr. Ehrman is actually a textual critic, not a historian as such, though I don't say that to denigrate him in any way.
And how it all correlates, most historians accept this as a valid early independent source of Jesus' existence. And speaking of other evidence to add to the pile, we have a rather more ironclad reference in the writings of another of the most famous historians of the period, Flavius Josephus, a man born in Jerusalem almost to the year when Jesus is thought to have been crucified.
Okay, now he's setting up Josephus by telling us beforehand that the evidence is ironclad. I mean, just let the evidence speak for itself, I'd say.
Twice in Antiquities, written about half a century after Jesus was executed. That said, the first mention in Book 18 is generally thought to have been altered at some point in history in its details. However, most historians accept that the reference to Jesus here is
Simon obviously likes talking about Josephus because he gives a couple of minutes background about him, which I've omitted here. In the clip you just saw, he's referring to the famous Testimonium Flavianum, which is a very unlikely passage in Antiquities 18, where the author gushes about Jesus being more than a man and being the Christ. Historians do think this section was added by later Christians. After all, Josephus' work only survives by being copied by Christians over the centuries. And it seems impossible to modern historians that a member of the Jewish faith like Josephus wasn't a Christian, who had witnessed the fall of Jerusalem and had switched sides to the Romans at the last minute, that he would ever have thought that a crucified criminal was the Messiah. As mentioned earlier, the Jewish Messiah was supposed to come and impose peace on the world, not die in obscurity as a criminal. Let's hear Whistler reading the passage in question.
And just universally copied from there. In this one it states, and on the screen the bits in brackets are the parts that were probably later added, quote, "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats, and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvellous things about him, and the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not
Josephus was writing in Rome for Romans in the late 1st century CE. He also never met Jesus, as he would have been too young, so all he can really attest to, like Tacitus, is that Christians existed as a group by the 90s CE. Now, as to this particular passage, you can see that all of the parts in brackets, which are widely believed to be later interpolations, refer to Jesus as more than a man, basically. What has happened here is that modern historians, not knowing really which bits have been added, have assumed that Josephus did write all of it, except the bits which we think he would not have agreed with. And this is begging the question, how can you make the assumption in the first place that he wrote as much of it as possible if we think it's an interpolation? And how can you use that as proof of Jesus' existence if we can't honestly say that he wrote any of this section? What I mean is, imagine for a moment that Jesus had never heard of this specific Jesus, and that this whole passage was added by Christians at a later date. How would we show that? You can't just assume that as much of the passage as possible was written by Josephus and then start deleting the odd word or phrase here and there to leave you with something about Jesus that seems secular and non-religious, and then wave that around as proof that the real Josephus knew that Jesus was a historical person. It's incredibly tenuous, and yet Simon Whistler is right. This is currently the scholarly consensus on this passage among historians and scholars. If there were any more convincing evidence for Jesus' existence than this, I don't think we'd be hearing about the Testimonium Flavianum at all, since it really is grasping at straws. You will note, however, that I can't prove that Josephus didn't write the secular bits of this passage. It's just that the simplest solution, again, is the most likely according to Occam's razor, and I find it much simpler to think that this one passage that mentions Jesus was added in by the Christians who preserved this text at some point in its history, as we know they often did with many other documents. And I think it's far less simple to start picking it apart to see how much of it we can keep so that we can use it to try to show desperately that Josephus thought there was a real historical Jesus. It seems far more likely that Josephus had never heard of this Jesus, especially if Jesus had never actually existed, right? Simon Whistler also mentions the 10th century Arabic translation of Josephus's Antiquities. But seriously, a document that dates to 1,000 years after the supposed fact? Please. Even then, it's just a differently worded version of the passage, which isn't that surprising considering that Latin and Arabic are very different languages.
About it. As the second reference that he quoted, but the important part is embedded in an account of an event in which a new high priest decided to take advantage of the fact that the Roman procurator Albinus was out of town and have executed some individuals that he didn't like. To quote, so he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. End quote.
Right, this, as I mentioned earlier, is possibly the most compelling evidence for Jesus' historical existence. James, the brother of Jesus, and it seems to match up with the few mentions of James, Jesus' brother, from the Gospels, which I think you could argue are independent of Josephus, and that Josephus didn't know the Gospels. Even so, Josephus mentions about 20 different guys named Jesus throughout Antiquities, so the reference to James, the brother of Jesus, without any qualifier may be an indication that this too is a later addition by Christian copyists, since they wouldn't feel the need to elaborate on specifically which Jesus was being referred to, while Josephus would of course have no concept of a particular special Jesus being so well known as to not need any qualifier. On the other hand, since Jesus is only used here as a qualifier to show which James is being spoken about, you could argue that so long as there weren't multiple Jameses all with brothers called Jesus, then there would be no need to give any further details. The names Yaakov and Yeshu were quite common, though, at the time, so this passage could actually be talking about anybody with those names. We just don't know. Some argue that the references to James in the book of Acts match up with Josephus, but Acts isn't any more history than the Gospels are, and it was probably written after Josephus, and the author may even have been using Josephus as a source, according to some historians, including Dr. Steve Mason, who is an expert on Josephus. Where does this leave us? Well, we have two passages in Josephus which may or may not have been added later by Christians, and which may or may not refer to a historical Jesus that Josephus definitely didn't meet. And that's not exactly convincing evidence, I would say.
Various reasons. For example, we have such a text as a letter from a Stoic philosopher from Syria, Mara. Writing the letter from prison after his city was captured by the Romans, Mara states, quote, what else can we say when the wise are forcibly dragged off by tyrants, their wisdom is captured by insults, and their minds are oppressed and without defense? What advantage did the Athenians gain from murdering Socrates? Famine and plague came upon them as punishment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment, their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of hunger. The Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, and the Jews desolate and driven from their own kingdom, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates is not dead because of Plato, neither is Pythagoras because of the statue of Juno, nor is the wise king because of the new law he laid down, end quote. However, it's not clear when exactly this letter was written, possibly as early as 73 AD, and that is the general consensus, but also possibly as much as a couple of hundred years after this. If the former, which again is the general consensus, it would be among the earliest references to Jesus.
Okay, well, we're already getting pretty desperate here. This guy wrote a letter at some time saying that the Jews killed their king who laid down a new law. I mean, this is so vague that it could even refer to the Judean civil war under the Maccabees in the 1st century BCE. Also, Simon Whistler follows the popular tradition of assuming that any text referring to Jesus should be dated as early as humanly possible. But this is probably not the case. If a text could have been written between, say, 73 CE and the 3rd century CE, most scholars do tend to assume that it was written around 73 CE, right at the earliest point of that huge scale. Therefore, asserting, as Simon does here, that this is early evidence, when there's no reason that it couldn't be a Christian document from well into the 2nd or 3rd century. Now, I don't actually think that this text is anything like as late as that, but I hope you can see how these sorts of assumptions, when you do that with several texts at a time, can give a false composite picture of how developed an idea or a movement might have been along the historical timeline. Even so, I see nothing in this, even if it was early, I see nothing in this particular reference that attests to historical Jesus. At most, we can say that this is a reference to early Christians making the claim that the Jews killed their king, and that the king had laid down a new law. This is a fairly garbled and simplistic view of the Christian message, and it seems pretty realistic that someone could have got this idea from meeting any group of Christians in the late 1st or early 2nd century CE, or any time after that.
To be who is being referred to. Potentially a lot more significant is Roman historian Suetonius' account, which is very similar to the aforementioned Tacitus reference. In his Lives of the 12 Caesars, 121 AD, he also mentions Nero abusing the Christians. But more pertinently, in the Life of Claudius, he states, "Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, Claudius expelled them from Rome." This is thought to be referencing an event that occurred around 50 AD, and seems to also be what Acts 8:2 in the New Testament is referring to, where it states, "After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There, he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome." While many think the Chrestus here is referring to Jesus, the specific spelling and wording leaves some ambiguity, given it seems as if Chrestus was still alive, instigating these disturbances. Noteworthy on this one, however, is that it is entirely possible Suetonius just thought Chrestus was still alive. Another alternative is Suetonius was just meaning it was the teachings of Chrestus that were causing the issues, or perhaps he was talking about someone else.
Yeah, I mean, even in Simon Whistler's presentation, this seems pretty weak as an argument for a historical Jesus, since it's obviously talking about a leader in Rome, not in Palestine or Judea, inciting the Christians to revolt during the time of Nero, which was about 25 years after the supposed time of Jesus. Even setting aside the fact that Jesus isn't said to have incited revolt, the time and place immediately make it impossible for this to be a reference to the historical Jesus, if one existed. Even then, the spelling of the name Christos appears to have been altered in the manuscript to make it resemble the word Christ. And one thing that often isn't mentioned is that Christos was actually a fairly common Roman name for a man. It's a common, normal name anyway. And it seems far more believable that Christos was a Roman Christian leader in Nero's Rome than that he was a man called Jesus living in a different time and place than the reference is actually talking about.
As you can imagine, the slight ambiguity in wording sees this one largely dismissed as definitive of anything. Moving on from there, Pliny the Younger, in a letter to Emperor Trajan in 112 AD, discussing the cult of Christianity, states, "They, Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a god, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up, after which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but of an ordinary and innocent kind." End quote. Unfortunately for this one, baby Pliny doesn't seem to have any real source for the reference to Christ here, other than the Christian.
And that's correct. Pliny and Trajan is great because it attests to some of the earliest Christians, but it doesn't attest to a historical Jesus in any way. It just shows that there was a Christian movement happening 40 or 50 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. I like the detail in this quote as well. I noticed that Pliny includes that Christians never deny a trust. The reason I like that is because it seems to refer to an additional commandment that Jesus slips into the more traditional commandments when he lists them in the Gospel of Mark chapter 10. If you go and have a look at Mark chapter 10, you'll see that Jesus lists the non-theistic 10 commandments. When the author of the Gospel of Matthew copies that list from Mark, he omits the commandment not to defraud because he knows it isn't in the original 10. But I digress. Let's carry on and see if Whistler's next piece of evidence is any more convincing than what we've seen so far.
Add anything to the most likely much more well-researched sources in Tacitus and Josephus. We could go on and on and on various references like this that historians for one reason or another debate the value of in terms of answering the question of whether Jesus existed or not, along with things he may or may not have done. In the end, in modern times, we're used to having video, picture, or significant documented evidence various people exist today. Like, we're pretty confident none of you out there thinks that I'm not a real person. This is despite the fact that you've never met me, never seen me, and even don't really know if I am, in fact, a product of clever AI video generation, which would go a long way towards explaining how I appear on so many channels. Unfortunately for historians, they, on the whole, don't have the luxury of such robust datasets and must look at a preponderance of often rather scant evidence and then apply the standard criteria of historical investigation to determine the likelihood of a person existing or some event having happened or not.
Yes, that's what I said, scant. I can't really believe that Simon Whistler is saying that because they didn't have video back then, we should just accept that Jesus existed because, despite there being no compelling evidence for it, just because most historians think so. As I said earlier, an argument from consensus or from authority doesn't actually prove anything. Once you've taken the time to look into the evidence yourself with a dispassionate eye, it's difficult to then buy into someone else's ideologically motivated conclusion, no matter how many PhDs they might have. The truth is that the evidence doesn't support the existence of a historical Jesus any more than it supports the idea that he didn't exist. I would remind you, however, that it would be basically impossible to prove that somebody from the Bronze Age didn't exist at all. But it would only need one piece of compelling evidence to prove that a person did exist, such as the evidence we do have for Pontius Pilate, Julius Caesar, or Alexander the Great, and so on and so on. Unfortunately, no such evidence does exist to prove that there was a real historical Jesus. In the rest of his video, Whistler talks about the bits of the Gospels that historians do or don't think actually happened, based on their opinions of what seems realistic. And that includes references to John the Baptist. As I said earlier, I do think we can be fairly confident that John the Baptist existed, and I like the idea of Jesus having been the Baptist's cousin and a member of his group before John the Baptist's arrest, and I like the idea that Dr. James Tabor has put forward about the Jesus dynasty, essentially that the Jesus movement in Jerusalem was presided over by Jesus' brothers until the time of the Jewish War. All of that would require there to have been a historical Jesus, right? But even though I like all of those ideas, it doesn't mean I'm going to start pretending that we actually do have better evidence for Jesus' existence than what we've gone over here in this video. So, thank you for watching the video to the end, and please feel free to have at it in the comments, and please feel free to share this video as well if you have anybody else that you think might have an opinion or want to chime in the comments, or you just want to wind somebody up that thinks Jesus did exist, then please feel free to share the video. And obviously, like, subscribe and click the notification bell. The channel, I have been focusing a little bit on Christianity recently, but really the channel wants to focus on world religions generally, so it's, hopefully interesting to some of you. But yeah, I will say again that this question really should be all about the evidence or the lack of evidence, not about any assertions and insults. So if you are going to comment, please be nice. As I said earlier, it doesn't even really matter whether Jesus existed, since we can't say whether it would have made much difference to the world we actually live in now. It's clear to me that the Christian movement did start, and that there were socio-political reasons for its success and popularity, and for its continued longevity in the many forms that Christianity takes today. And whether or not there was a guy called Jesus who started that movement, and was the inspiration for all of that, is actually irrelevant, I'd say, even if the evidence does seem completely unconvincing when you take a closer look. All right, that's it from me. Be excellent to each other, and yeah, have a good day.